Tom, good to have you on the podcast. Tell us a bit about yourself, your role and where you are and things like that.
Okay, so as you said, I'm Tom. I'm a year six teacher at the British International School of Chicago. I've only joined here quite recently, so I joined this school in August, but I've been on the international scene now for about 10 years. I think this is actually my 10th year abroad. So I've also taught in British international schools in Mexico City. I've taught in Prague, and I've taught in Portugal before here. But I started in the great city of Lincoln at a school there, and I also studied at Bishop Grot University. I'm currently undertaking my master's in international education as well.
Okay, great. So as we've agreed, we're going to talk about creativity in your practice or in your teaching practice. And so just wondering, what is creativity to you?
Yeah, so it's a hard question, this, isn't it? It's one that seems very obvious, but actually, when you start thinking about what creativity is, it's one of those things that you feel you know exactly what it is, but it's quite hard to define. And you can find all sorts of things that aren't creativity and loopholes to the rule. But it's one of those things that you feel like you've got a good grasp on, but actually, if you like when you've asked me the question, I haven't got an exact phrase for you. Having started the masters and doing some work actually on creativity, one of the first things you have to do is kind of, before you start an academic essay, is obviously define exactly what you're talking about. And when you read through the literature, there's varying kind of different definitions of creativity, and I've kind of bounced between a few. I think my starting point was Ken Robinson, who kind of defines it very simply as it's a new thought that has some sort of purpose, that has some sort of meaning. So I think that's quite a nice starting point. As in my context inside a classroom, I always think of creativity almost as being, I guess, like the ability for a child to imagine something that they've not seen before or done before. So I don't know, giving them a task where they've taken something or they've taken a story and they've not copied the story from something else. They can be inspired, but they've imagined something new that they've not encountered before. Now, this can be, I think, creativity, just solely the concept of creativity, if we go off that definition, can be very, very useful, but it can also be, for example, if I gave you a book and I said, okay, can you imagine like a different way to use this book? You've got the classic way of reading it, but you could also use it as a hat. You could use it as a thing to stand on. You could throw it at someone. And so those are probably new ideas that the kids haven't maybe witnessed before, but it's not necessarily a useful idea. So as a teacher, I think an important thing as well is to take creativity, which is maybe this raw concept of kind of thinking of new, like novel ideas for at least for the students, and helping them direct it and develop it towards something that will be of use for them. And hopefully as they develop as learners and develop as people, that can get bigger and bigger on the scale. So maybe in the classroom, you're setting up problems that they can solve using a route that's not been presented to them by the teacher, but they brought in their prior knowledge and thought of it. Maybe they're writing a story and they maybe can base it on other things, but their story is completely new to them and the idea in the story. And as they get older and they go into the adult life or they go through secondary school, they can start expanding that. So the idea is that one day they can go out into the working world or into the real world or into their life, and they can use their imagination for something that's going to be important for them.
Is it something that is quite easy or straightforward for you to think of when it comes to like your practice, by presenting something that is different or new to them that they would find useful?
No, I think it's really hard. And I think one of the big, go back to Ken Robinson again. So when I first went into teaching and did my teacher training, Ken Robinson, and he's got the very successful TED Talk video where he speaks about using creativity in education and how it's a really undervalued skill. And when I first went into teaching, that video was kind of a really important thing for me. I took like the sentiment from that and really wanted to put it, like embed it in all the things I do inside the classroom. However, I think what a lot of teachers find is we're very on board for the idea of developing creativity in the classroom, but actually how you do that whilst juggling other things like, I don't know, showing that you've got progress, making sure you're getting through the whole curriculum, making sure you've got good work in the books, I think is a much more difficult thing. And actually doing, like I said, I'm doing the masters at the university at the moment, and I've had a chance to kind of reflect on creativity. And actually reading the literature has given me a lot of ideas of how I can incorporate different like strategies into developing creativity in different ways as well that I think traditionally I would think of. So to kind of give you an example, I think early, I mean, if going back to Ken Robinson, if when he does his TED talk, he talks a lot about the arts and how the arts are so important to creativity, which is obviously true. But I think, I teach the core subjects. I teach English, math, and social sciences. I think there's a lot of opportunity there as well to bring creativity in, giving kids different problems that they've not, done before, and letting them think of ways around it and solve them.
Mm. What does it look like though in a subject that is like seen as not, creative subjects, if you like, like let's say maths or English. What would that look like in a classroom?
So, I mean, maybe I'll give you an example of. So, let's take an English lesson. And something
Hmm.
that we've done quite recently is creative writing. And obviously, I mean, it's in the name already that there's the creative element for this. One thing that I've changed recently is I've tried to kind of give an expansion. So, I've read some really good articles about how you can kind of create the conditions for creativity. And there was a paper that really stood out to me called the Idea Journey by Perry Smith and Minucci. And this was not actually designed for classrooms; it was designed for businesses. But it talked about the process of taking initial ideas and seeing them all the way through the process to the point of actually having them implemented. And as a teacher, it was really good to read something and actually be like, okay, here's actually a framework that you can go from and have the steps of how to take an initial like that creativity and develop it into a useful idea at the end. So just, I mean, generally the framework that Perry Smith and Minucci have is that you have a lot of ideas and then you have a lot of socialization. So you have the idea exposed to different teams. There's a lot of feedback and developing the ideas. And then at the end, you've narrowed it down to one really good idea that can maybe be implemented in a company. So having read that, I did apply it I tried to bring it into a series of English lessons that we were doing. And one thing that was really different to how I had originally imagined developing like creativity in the classroom was I always thought that it was maybe you would start off with so like a classic way that I would do creative writing is I would do the first lesson where I'd be like, okay, guys, we're doing a story about this. Maybe we're doing like a suspenseful story and we're setting it in a certain scene. And I give the kids maybe some props. And then I'd say, okay, think of your idea now. Okay, here's a sheet, note down the key things of the idea. And then once they had the idea, we would just go straight into developing it. So then we'd be looking at, okay, maybe you're looking at the story structure, you're doing a story mountain. Maybe you're like describing the settings, we build up the skills, and then they write the story. However, reading this framework and reading one or two other things, it kind of occurred to me that one really key process that I've been missing out was taking lots of different ideas and having the kids be able to bounce between the different ideas. When I ever do anything, I like to have a few different things to think about and kind of let it, I don't know, brew in my mind. Like if you're going on vacation, I'll look up like 8 different places and then slowly in my mind there's some sort of battle royale that goes on and I can narrow it down to one. And I felt like actually when I thought through this, I was like, we're kind of, I've at least been depriving the kids of this opportunity. So more recently when I did it, I approached it from a different angle and I thought, what I'm going to do is have a real focus on the idea generation process.
Mm-hmm.
So I gave the kids an opportunity I gave them some prompts. I gave some examples of what I was thinking if I was approaching a story. And then the kids had post-it notes and they were able to write, the target was to write 4 different ideas of what might happen in their story. And then we looked and we kind of shared our ideas. The kids got to go around the classroom and share their ideas. And then I asked them to expand it to 8. Because I think one of the key things is once you start hearing other people's ideas, it starts sparking different things in your mind. And you might think, oh, that's a good idea. I could be inspired by this. Or I like that direction of having it kind of more like a spooky story or something like this. That's a good character setting. And I found that actually as the kids spoke more to other students in kind of a low stakes environment in a place where they feel quite comfortable, they're used to chatting to other kids and not presenting their work currently. And they've just post-it notes. They've got 4 different ones and they're very disposable. They were quite quick to get to 4 ideas to 8 ideas was actually very quick process. like I said, the post-it notes, the whole idea was that they could have them, they could get rid of them, and it was very easy to add more ideas or take ideas away. Now, normally, if I was doing a sequence of lessons like that, I would very quickly try and move on to get down to one idea and see how we're feeling. But what I was really keen was the kids went away, they had sleep. I think sleep's really important in this process. You know, the amount of times that you relax and actually come back to an idea the next day, and you can think that's a terrible idea, or you might think this is a brilliant idea. So the kids came back in, and they had a chance to evaluate their post-it notes. And I gave them the option of, if there's any stories now you don't think would make a good story, you can chuck them, you can get rid of them. If you've had a chance to think of some new ideas, you can add them into the pot. And we had, as we went through the steps of developing their ideas, we had, it's only until like they started to write the story did they start narrowing down the ideas. Mm. So the idea, I wanted them to have like a bank of ideas rather than one individual idea they were developing. So again, we looked at the skills, we might have looked at some grammar things, we might have looked at describing the setting, we might have given them a chance to think of what characters could fit in their story. And only when it came down to actually to writing the story did I get them to choose their final one that they felt matched their idea. And I felt it was much better than having just one solitary idea going into it. Yeah. Again, I mean, that was a very specific way of how I brought in like a change I've made recently. I mean, to go to the subject that you mentioned and mathematics, this is something I think, again, where when I was at school, I would have thought of maths as being kind of the opposite of the creative subject. And it's sometimes presented on a linear scale, that we have like the arts on one side, and they're the creative subjects, and we have things like math and science on the other side. And then maybe like more of a logic-based subject. But I think it's never straight cut as that. And actually, if we go back to that original definition we're talking about of creativity is the ability to apply an idea to like a new situation, or to imagine something you've not seen before, then actually the only way that math is going to be implemented in a useful way is kids having the knowledge but applying it, thinking of it in a different manner. Again, it's a really hard thing to do, especially when there's pressures to have things like presented in books, when there's a strict curriculum to get through. I think setting mathematics as much as you can in like a real world context really helps. I'm really intrigued by the idea of project-based learning, where this is like the concept that kids are given maybe a big problem or a project that they work through, and all subjects are kind of mixed in together over maybe like a 4 to 8 week timescale with an end project that they're working towards. And so I think that can be a really nice way of elevating math from just being in the textbook, but actually taking the knowledge and seeing how they can apply it to different situations. So for example, like you might be doing, I don't know, you might do a project-based learning feature on like a theme park. And so in that you could do the traditional learning about things like speed and like distances, and you could do like addition and subtraction using decimals. And then in the project, you could link that to things like, you could set up a budget so the kids are using their skills, but they're applying their skills to like setting up a budget for a roller coaster park, and they're thinking what the prices need to be, how much they can allocate towards building rides. They can measure the lengths of different roller coasters. They can be checking the area. And so they're taking the knowledge that they've already got in their head, and then they're trying to apply it to something they've created and thinking about it in a different context.
So what is it exactly that is making that approach creative from what you're describing?
I would think it's not just thinking of it in the terms that maybe a teacher has taught you. So in the classroom setting, if you're doing like a classic thing where the kids have questions and they're working out in their book, they're often just applying the technique that the teacher's shown them to the questions, and the numbers might change, but the formula kind of stays the same. However, giving students the problem of something, or getting them to apply it to a situation where the teacher's maybe not guided them through it, they need to, I think creativity is really based in the knowledge. There's a big interplay between the knowledge and the thought process to something new, but they're taking their existing knowledge and they're applying it. It's that pathway of applying it to a new situation, using their imagination to apply it to something completely different that had maybe not been presented in the past.
So is the main focus here to get the students to develop their creativity, or to learn through creativity, or is there any value in your own practice, i.e., your pedagogy, to be creative?
So would you say, well, is creativity important to me as a teacher?
Yeah, as in like, because what you're describing, it's very much about the students themselves being creative and using creativity to sort of think about different ideas to achieve a particular goal, which is obviously what you talk about in terms of the value. But then when it comes to what you do, um, does it matter whether it is creative or not to you personally, or you might even think they're the same thing. Maybe they're not separate. Like like what I'm saying here. Like it's not about you doing something creative and they doing something creative. It's all part of the same process.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to inspire creativity, and especially in these cases, I guess it requires a creative element from myself. I think certainly thinking through, I mean, going back to the example of writing, I think it's really important to be able to write creatively in front of the children. I think a way to teach it as well is to really have a screen up while you're working on it, and the kids see the teacher doing it, and there's a modeling example. Um, yeah, I think there's definitely. I mean, are you asking? Sorry, Philip. Just going back to the idea. Are you asking? Is there a worth to creativity beyond just creativity for creativity's sake, or are you saying it's important as
Or
a
whether
class?
teaching practice should be creative, as long as you can have the students having creativity or being creative in the activities or the learning that they're undertaking. So, for example, they're writing creatively. For you personally, is there any value of you being able to be creative in terms of what you do as your pedagogy?
I mean, yeah. I mean, beyond all the teaching and things, I think it's creativity is good to have in the classroom just because it's fun for me. I mean, a lot of things that drive me as a teacher are things that, I like to enjoy school. I want to make school fun and active. And for the students is great, but also for myself, I want it to be an engaging and active, classroom. What I think, every classroom is kind of an independent thing as well. So I think teachers are always going to bring their creativity to the classroom environment, and every student is different and learning really needs to be tailored towards their student. And so teacher creativity is key to that, because you might be given the most comprehensive learning pack of resources that try to embed creativity and projects and things within it. However, it's only through the teacher's understanding of the nuances of student work and the needs and the requirements of the kids in the class that learning can really be tailored towards everybody's needs. So I do think, yeah, it's vital for teachers to have that creative element to them.
And
If
and
we,
how do you express that then? So like for you in your own practice, besides what the students are doing, what would you say for you if I was to say, Tom, when you are creative in your practice, what does that look like? What are you actually doing in this classroom? What would that be?
um, so I guess it's just like individualizing lessons, trying to make lessons different and match I don't know, the needs of the kids. I mean, I can give you some examples of lessons that I would hold up and say, I think this is something that's a bit different, or times that I've used creativity in my practice. The first school I worked in had was took lots of students from a council estate and had a lot of students who are like eligible for free school meals. And I remember we did a circle time activity with the students. They were in year four, and our national average was really good. The kids in my class were like mostly beyond the national average, and then we had some really strong kids who were very academic. And when we did the circle time, we talked about like aspirations that they had and jobs that they wanted. And I found that the kids didn't really have, I had no idea what they wanted to do in the future, which is fine. Or they not great aspirations, not very realistic things. And if I compare that right now, my context is working in a school where it's fee paying. And if like we did a similar thing recently, and most kids want to be a lawyer or an engineer or a doctor. And something struck me that actually perceptions strike children really early on. And so this was a classroom of 8-year-olds, and already a lot of them didn't have, I don't have any. I'm not having a job, go at any jobs, but they weren't looking at a huge aspirational thing, even though their data, even though the work they were producing was beyond their peers in schools that were in much more affluent areas. And so one thing that I tried to do was I thought, well, maybe my job as an educator could be to expose these kids to jobs that they don't encounter in their day-to-day lives. So I did lessons which were like medically based. I did some jobs which were like, I think at the time our thing was around the world. So we looked at different practices around the world. We looked at world leaders and things like that. But one job that I really liked was we did a mock stock market. Now, I'm not saying the stock market should be the aspiration for everybody to go into. I know it's a slightly problematic career, but I thought it was just an interesting thing to have kids to like. I don't think many of their parents would be working in finance. So to have just knowing what that is and what it might be like at an early age, I thought would be quite an important thing. And this stock market lesson it was also so much fun and got so much engagement from the kids. And I felt produced so much work, like good work from them, that I've taken it wherever I go. So I've taken it around the world, and wherever it goes, like a universal thing of now the kids get very excited for when we do the stock market. It essentially works that I make up a load of different companies, and some of the companies are based on real products. So there's like Moonbooks Coffee is one of them. Some of them are based on quite comical things. So there's Dino Park, which is based on like the idea of Jurassic Park. And there's normally a joke one, which is like Mr. Leach's like spoken word ABBA album or something like that. And so the kids have all these businesses proposed to them. And I talk about the mechanism of, okay, you've got some seed capital and you're going to take that money and you're going to invest in one of these companies. And so it looks at the risk and like reward elements of different like different companies that they're looking at. So the Mr. Leach spoken word one is really low reward, really high risk. And the kids are kind of make the decision of, okay, are they going to go for higher risk or are they going to go for something a bit more guaranteed to make money? And we do it at the front, we have a big dice or die, and we roll it, and like different numbers correspond to what happens in their company. So then the kids work out how much money they're making, they keep a budget, we're allowed to switch companies, they're allowed to invest in other things. And it gets the kids absolutely excited. The engagement's great. After a lesson, we might do this for an hour, and the kids have done maybe 60 or 70 calculations in that time, because every time the dice rolls, they're really enthusiastic to use it. Now, for me, the kids are applying their knowledge in different ways. They're having a real world purpose to their knowledge. But as an educator, this came from the basic problem that I'd identified that maybe the students' perception or aspirations and perceptions of themselves at young age was already not the greatest. And could I do anything to try and combat that? Now, the lesson actually, turned out to be a lot of fun. Whether, I wish I could tell you the end of the story is I got an email the other day and a kid's gone to do finance at Harvard University or something. That's never happened. But I like to think that in a small way, it contributed to just expanding the minds of the kids. It had a lot of good side products as well. And it only came about because as a teacher, I listened to the needs of the kids. We had a conversation and I was able to use my creativity to try and adapt the learning around that.
Why do you think something like, the lesson that you mentioned, why do you think it's more effective in engaging students? I mean, that's what I'm assuming from what you're describing, right?
Yeah.
So like, it's a better way to engage students, but I'm just wondering, why do you think that is?
I think there's a few different elements. I mean, for starters, it's kind of a novel environment. So normally it's quite a peaceful environment you kind of try to promote. But in like true tribute to Wall Street, there's quite a lot of shouting and jumping up and down and celebrating. So I think that the atmosphere helps. Now, I don't think you could maintain that throughout lots of different lessons. And in fact, I think this lesson works because it's different to what the kids normally do. I think there's almost a gamification of it. So there is a game of like choosing your risk, deciding strategies. We do it a few times over the year. And the kids kind of get used to the tactic of starting off with a lower risk thing, building up your money, and then being able to bet aggressively. So I think the competition and the game side of it is quite fun. There's an instant reward as well to a lot of the things they're doing. So when they do the calculation, there's a real purpose towards it. They get given, there's actually something that they're working out. They can see how much money they're doing. They can access the game because they're doing these calculations. However, in a classroom, if you're doing like a textbook, there's actually no real payoff other than the expectation of you as a learner. And maybe they're buying that this is important to them in the longer scheme of things. when they do a calculation, there's not like a big celebration. They don't get, they don't in their head feel like they've earned more money. So I think there's a few elements. I also think, I mean, I would never, for example, do it as a lesson observation because I think it is lacking some key things. Like it's not greatly differentiated. Obviously, it can feel slightly chaotic environment, which I think makes the fun of it. But for those reasons, I also think that it is a lesson within a series that goes quite nicely. But it's maybe not the. I don't think you could manage a classroom like that the whole time.
Mm. Do you think it actually leads to better impact or not?
I do. I think the kids need to have already a strong grasp of the skills they're using. And I think this is a lot of when we talk about creativity and learning through creativity, that you often have to have. I mean, I think there's the Picasso quote, which is something like, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. And I think to be able to get to that point, the kids need to have a really strong subject knowledge. If the kids didn't really know, I mean, that for that lesson, they need to know subtraction, addition, decimals, and various budgeting things like risk and reward and things like that. But if it didn't have a strong grasp, I think it would fall flat and you would have lots of errors being made. So I think you need to get to a certain point that way. But I think there's a real use in having a skill that they know quite, they've got a strong grasp of, and then being able to apply it to a different situation and seeing there's a reward to it. I think it helps embed those neurons shooting down the same thing. And like I said, I think there is a worth in just applying skills to different things, like having to imagine how would I use the skill for this.
So what is it that you're trying to achieve to include something like a creative lesson?
I mean, I think creativity has value for a number of different reasons. Creativity alongside of a higher level thinking skills have always been important. But I think the world that we're going into, these higher level thinking skills that include creativity, are gaining prominence. The need to equip students with them. You know, the future is more unclear now than I've ever known it. I mean, if you compare to how quickly the job market's changing, but also just the social market, like you look at things like social media and the development of AI and the world that the kids are going to go into, but also the world the kids are kind of existing in now is changing rapidly. And I think only creativity allows us as people, but also the students to kind of navigate this. I mean, from my own experience from when I was a student, the jobs that were presented to me, like a lot of those have now, you know, stable jobs that would have once been like this is future-proof industry are kind of on decline. And jobs that would have never heard of are now quite prominent. I mean, I know this is not a job for everybody, but I remember first hearing the term YouTuber and not realizing that, like, I knew what YouTube was, but I didn't realize there was an occupation based off the top of that. And so I think it's really important for the kids to have, you know, this creativity and the ability to think in ways that they've maybe not been presented before is vital in a world that's quickly changing. The kids exist now in a space as well where there's so much information being presented, but there's misinformation in that. Social media comes with all sorts of different problems. And I think to give the kids the ability to navigate the online world that they're increasingly existing in, creativity, but other critical thinking skills like being able to spot for like misinformation, but just, you know, thinking about where this source has come from, having a natural skepticism of certain things, and it is really key. So they're turning, you know, I think they exist in the technology world where technology can be something that's incredibly harmful, but it can also be the most empowering tool that maybe humans have had ever. And so making sure that students use their devices and they use their presence for good and for you know, get the maximum potential out of it and not be led into things that we've seen have had really detrimental effects on students. So sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, like, earlier, because like you alluded to having worked in all these different settings, you know, in different countries. I'm just intrigued to know whether you found your experience to be able to be creative, or you know, how your peers would think about that kind of approach to teaching learning. Do you think, like, you know, there has been any difference or differences between different countries that you've worked in terms of how people perceive or are motivated to be creative in terms of teachers?
In terms of teachers, maybe. It's hard to say because obviously every school has is very different. But even every individual that you think of working with is different. And I would have been different in each context. I think my view on education changes, and my understanding of things has changed. I would say at the moment, when I worked in England, I definitely would say there's a move towards stifling creativity. I think English schools are really brilliant, and I think there's really wonderful teachers. In all the teachers I've met in England, I think are working really well under difficult conditions. I think though, there's especially when you go up the school, there's a real push towards narrowing the curriculum so it fits with testing culture. And I think at least when I worked in the UK, that the looming like threat of Ofsted really affected how we taught things.
Why is that? What is things like, for example, if you talk about Ofsted or any kind of like, maybe the focus on exams, what is it that actually is restricting creativity, or is it just a perception that people have that is stopping them from being creative? So, for example, is teaching to exams, does it have to be not creative, or can it still be creative?
I think, definitely you need creativity in exams. I think that it can still be creative. But I found from my experience, normally when your sole aim is getting progress data on tests, you narrow what you're doing in the classroom to the extent that you're really just looking at exam questions. You're looking, instead of trying to develop the deeper understanding of a concept, you're looking at the formulas that exam questions often come up in. You're teaching tricks like, I don't know, it's a 3-mark question, make sure that you answer, and you almost give the kids a structured thing that they need to go off. You try and develop a certain way of writing that suits exams to a certain degree, or a certain way that in a math test you might present, you get this kind of problem. If you recognize this, you need to show these steps, even if you don't get the answer right. If you do these steps, you can get 2 marks, kind of thing. So I think anything that makes education narrow to the point that you're almost doing a really surface deep level representation of progress, I think reduces creativity in learning. I think there is another way that you could do it. I think you could try and you could really promote creativity and high level thinking, and you think actually if you develop students who have a really deep understanding of the curriculum and have really creative skills, that actually if you put them in any context like an exam, they would flourish. But I think the problem is the pressure on time and the classroom environment means that often schools have this perception to try and just teach towards the test in the way I just described. And I think one thing that also happens when you have Ofsted putting so much pressure on the leadership of the school is that the ability of the teacher to navigate, and like I said, how important it was earlier in this podcast, how important it is for the teacher to be able to use the creativity and recognize nuance for the needs of the students. But actually, when you are having so much pressure from the top down kind of construction of education means that often you're really being pushed towards a certain system, which is this kind of guiding them to the formula of exam questions. I think Ofsted as well, if I could just throw this in, now I've not taught, as I said, in the UK for 10 years, but one thing I have experienced is how different like regulations or bodies overseeing schools operate. And when I was in England, which would 10 years ago now, Ofsted would operate through, they would come into a school, they would see the school in primary setting for 2 or 3 days. They would observe maybe each teacher once or twice. And then I felt there was a lot of like gathering evidence to support the conclusion they've already made based on the SATs results of the school. And I think it was from just, from my own experience, I don't think there was a lot of times that they would change this opinion. It meant that schools then were pressured to do very superficial things. So our books were pristine, but often you would do things, for example, I've heard stories, I didn't do this, but I've heard stories of to show that students were responding to feedback and to make it look like there was good editing in like writing books. Teachers would write on post-it notes, write this word, change this word for this, change this word for this. And so the student would go through and make it look like there was good editing, but it's cheating. I don't think there's any other way to do it. But when the pressure is that if it's tight and a head teacher could lose their job through a bad set of assessment data, and Ofsted's going to come in and do this kind of very naming and shaming thing of giving a grade making it very public and going around the school looking for any evidence, then naturally you're going to have leadership putting pressure on teachers to do everything they can to present a very like I said, surface deep element. So I think things like that really take any like chance of promoting a creative classroom out, because really you're putting a lot of pressure is on like marking books to a certain thing, which
Yeah,
is,
yeah,
feedback is very important, but it's taking away other things you can do as a teacher.
yeah.
I've seen it in other places. I mean, so for example, now I work for a company and they at least present their ideas like this. So they, instead of naming and shaming a school, they obviously own the school, so it's a different context. But they don't just do a inspection every 4 or 5 years. They work with the schools every year. Every school has, whether it's the best school in the chain or the school needing the most improvement, they all have targets they're working towards. And if a school is not getting to the point where they're meeting those targets, instead of having the school panicking and trying to, like I said, like do things to make it look like they're achieving, they instead provide the school with the resources and the things they need to help them actually meet those goals. And I think that can be a much more healthy relationship with a body.
Mm.
Whether it translates down to the teacher level, developing more creativity, I don't know, but at least offers the chance. Because I think if you're working in a really high pressure environment where there's a very narrow thing that you're aiming for, there's no chance for the educator to promote creativity. However, if there is more freedom on the teacher, there is at least that chance where the teacher can develop the learning towards the needs of the kids.
So from the school's leadership perspective, what else is there that you think would be very important in terms of being able to enable uh, teachers to be creative in their practice?
I think time and training is always really important for teachers. Um, the more time that I think you're given, the more time you have to create resources and really reflect on your learning. I taught in a school where you didn't really have. I mean, I think I went 4 hours without a break, so not even like, because it was another school in the US. You would go out with the kids for recess and you'd be with them at lunch, and so your only break would be a specialist lesson in the afternoon, and so you're with the kids for such a huge amount of time that by the time the day came around to the end, you only had enough energy just to get the basic resources ready. I find that when you have more time away from the kids, you have more time to elevate the learning, actually look through the books, actually reflect. And so I think giving teachers time is really important. And I think training is really good as well. I read a thing that teachers in Singapore, I think, have something like 20% of their time now, maybe it's even more. It's almost like a day a week, the equivalent of that, is dedicated to just professional development, non-contact time with the kids. And the results in those schools are really excellent. Singapore is one of the world leaders for education.
Mm.
So I think giving teachers proper training, but also allowing teachers to choose their path of training, can be really important as well. So they have that ability to reflect. I mean, like I said, a lot of the ideas that I've talked about today have come from the masters, where I've had a chance to reflect and read different sources about creativity. And I've been able to take those things and put them into the classroom in ways that I wasn't fully expecting to do. So allowing teachers that chance to read different ideas, I think it does inspire, I don't know, them to develop their practice.
So for individual practitioners, what tips would you offer when it comes to implementing creativity? So obviously you've tried and been quite successful in implementing creativity in your practice. For somebody who's not so confident in being creative in their practice, what tips would you offer them to say, like, this is what you could try, or this is what would make it work well, that sort of thing?
So I'd say give the kids a chance to think of lots of ideas. I mentioned why that was so important earlier. I'd say, but certainly in my context, in the primary school context, let the kids kind of be kids. Children are naturally very imaginative things. One thing I've done really recently is I saw in a reception class, they have like a dress up box, and so there's a big box where it's full of costumes and props and toys. And so actually we had a school pantomime, and the props from that were kind of hadn't got a home. So I brought this big box now in my classroom, which has got full of like fairy and wizard outfit costumes. And so I've got that in my classroom. And so sometimes when we've done like story idea generation, the kids have access to physical things that they can do. And it's great just seeing them mess around. And even though year six in the classroom, they come across very mature. If you give them the chance to be kids, they will play and they will learn. So I'd say really learn on kids' natural desire or natural ability to be creative. Um, I think allowing kids to make mistakes and I mentioned using post-it notes, but using whiteboards or even using the devices so they can delete ideas and change ideas, I think is really important. I would say another really key thing is giving kids a chance to talk through their ideas and be exposed to other ideas. So making sure there's lots of talk for learning, talking to other students, listening to other ideas, or maybe seeing the teacher model some key ideas is really vital as well. And just giving the kids like the element of time. Sometimes I think earlier on in when I'd be teaching, a writing lesson might just be one lesson or two lessons, but actually if you give the kids enough time to really develop it and come back to it and have a bit of freedom over their work, you can see ideas really flourish in that as well.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much, Tom. It's been great having you talking about your experience, and it's really valuable just to see like what creativity can look like in practice. So thank you very much for that. My final question for you is, what if you have to say in one word, in teaching and learning, what is not creativity?
Oh, so not creativity, I would say in what it's just one word.
One word.
Oh my goodness. This is pressure. This is requiring all the creativity I have to think of this. Um, okay. I'm I'm really struggling with this. I've got what I want to say, but I'm trying to think of how to say it as a flip. Okay. The word I'm going to settle on, and I'm not very happy with it, but it's like bound. You can't. I was going to go with imprison, but I think that's too rough. Okay, it's like you can't be bound to an idea. You can't be imprisoned to a certain philosophy. I think freedom helps. So, do you have a better word, Philip, than bound? Like a straitjacket. That's kind of what I'm going for. I think
Yeah, yeah.
being compressed is the opposite of creativity.
Okay, I'll take that.
Okay, compressed. There we
Okay,
go.
thank you very much,
Right.
Tom.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you for having me.